Nora Ellison walked home beneath the wide Santa Fe sky, the horizon painted in soft purples and desert gold. The evening air was still, and the quiet hum of adobe-lined streets brought a kind of peace that didn't quite reach her. As a museum exhibit designer, Nora spent her days crafting spaces that told beautiful stories, but lately her own story felt hollow, the light in her life fading slowly, without alarm. Her sandals tapped softly on the pavement as she approached the house she and Adam had shared for over a decade. On the surface, everything was in place. The wind chimes danced, the porch light flickered to life automatically, but something inside felt off-kilter, like a sculpture slightly out of balance. She paused before turning the doorknob, catching her reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, a practiced smile, the kind worn by someone holding things together for too long. The door creaked open, revealing a stillness she'd come to expect. There were no children's voices anymore, one off at culinary school, the other apprenticing in town, and Adam, her husband, was likely working late again. The silence that greeted her wasn't just absence, it was emotional erosion. Power flickered briefly, casting shadows across the textured walls. The light came back on, but for Nora, it didn't matter. The darkness hadn't come from a power line. It had settled in long ago like dust in forgotten corners, and tonight, for reasons she couldn't yet name, that darkness felt heavier than usual. Nora stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the soft latch echoing through a home that no longer felt like one. The adobe walls, once warm and filled with the scent of roasted chilies and fresh paint from weekend art projects, now stood cold and quiet. The open-plan living room was still curated with taste, woven rugs, handmade pottery, abstract prints from local artists, but none of it moved her anymore. She drifted toward the kitchen, her footsteps muted by the clay tile beneath her. The air smelled faintly of the morning's untouched coffee, now bitter and stale. On the countertop sat a bowl of fruit, untouched for days, next to a postcard from their daughter pinned beneath a magnet. Nora ran her hand across the surface without purpose, her fingers pausing on the worn edge of a recipe card she hadn't used in months. She used to fill this house with color and energy, with laughter and motion. Gallery lighting tests for museum pieces, trial exhibits sprawled across the dining room table, playlists drifting through the air. Now, it all felt still, like a staged exhibit frozen in time. Adam's jacket wasn't on the hook. His boots weren't by the door. She didn't expect them to be. Lately, even when he was home, it felt like he wasn't. Conversations had shrunk to calendar updates and vague dinner plans. They passed each other like strangers who used to be in love. And in the quiet, Nora realized something haunting. This wasn't just a phase. The house hadn't simply grown still. It had forgotten how to breathe. Every room felt like a pause between sentences. Every object like a ghost of a story that had already ended, but no one had dared to say the final word. There was a time when Nora and Adam spoke in a language all their own. Inside jokes whispered across rooms, passionate debates over gallery layouts and nonprofit campaigns, late-night confessions shared over wine-stained lips. But that language had withered into silence, replaced by brief exchanges about errands, work, and the weather. Now, every conversation felt like a monologue delivered to an absent audience. Nora found herself speaking carefully, editing her words before they left her mouth, unsure if Adam was even listening. He responded in nods and generic hums, always distracted, always somewhere else. His phone became his constant companion, glowing in the dark between them like a barrier. She remembered when he used to show her his ideas, ask for her thoughts, pull her into his world of donor pitches and networking events. Now he mentioned names she didn't recognize and laughed at jokes she hadn't heard. Sometimes she caught him smiling at his screen, not at her. Their routines stayed intact. Shared coffee in the morning, brief dinners in the evening, but the intimacy was gone. It had slipped out the back door, quietly, like a guest overstaying their welcome. Nora tried to reignite something, a planned weekend getaway, a surprise lunch at his office, but each effort met a polite decline or a distracted apology. She began to wonder if Adam noticed at all, if he saw the sadness behind her smile or heard the weight behind her silence. In the quiet of their evenings, surrounded by curated art and perfectly placed lighting, Nora began to accept what she hadn't dared to name aloud. Their marriage had become a performance for two people no longer willing to share the stage. They were actors reciting lines from an old script, long after the audience had gone home. The signs weren't explosive. They arrived like brush strokes on a canvas, subtle but deliberate, accumulating until the picture became impossible to ignore. Adam started dressing differently, crisp shirts tucked just right, a new leather satchel slung over his shoulder, hair styled with more intention than usual. He'd begun wearing a woody cologne Nora didn't recognize, one that lingered in the hallway long after he left for work. His schedule, once predictable, now shifted, unpredictably. Early meetings, late events, last-minute weekend fundraisers she'd never heard of before. Nora noticed the way he angled his phone away from her at dinner, how he stepped into another room to answer texts, his voice lower than usual. He mentioned Vivian Kane, his boss, often and always with a casual admiration that felt rehearsed. At first, Nora dismissed her suspicions as overthinking. But then came the quiet gestures, a soft smile at a message, a moment's hesitation when she entered the room, the vague explanations about who he was meeting after hours. None of it was concrete, nothing loud. But together, it formed a pattern, an abstract composition of secrets. As a designer trained to observe, to find meaning in small details, Nora couldn't unsee what she was beginning to suspect. The evidence wasn't in what Adam said, but in what he didn't, in the pauses, in the careful neutrality of his tone, in the way, slowly, his world seemed to tilt toward someone else and away from her. One evening, between half-finished takeout and a muted conversation about work, Adam casually mentioned the annual fundraising gala hosted by his foundation. "It's at the Chroma Gallery downtown," he said, eyes fixed on his phone. "Vivian's really pulling out all the stops this year." Nora looked up from her plate, curiosity piqued. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked, her voice light but hopeful. Adam hesitated, just for a moment, but it was long enough to feel heavy. "It's mostly donors and board members," he said with a shrug. "You'd probably be bored." He smiled quickly, trying to soften it, but the damage was done. Nora returned the smile, nodding as if she understood, but inside, something shifted. His words weren't just about the gala. They were a quiet exclusion, a reminder that whatever world he now moved in, she wasn't a part of it. That night, as Adam fell asleep beside her, Nora lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She didn't ask again. She didn't argue. But a decision took root. She would go. Not as his guest, not as a partner. She would go as a woman who needed to see the truth for herself, whatever it turned out to be. On the night of the gala, Nora stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, brushing a few strands of hair behind her ear as she slipped into a sleek black dress she hadn't worn in years. It wasn't for Adam. It was for clarity. The Chroma Gallery shimmered in the Santa Fe evening, its modern glass facade glowing under soft desert lighting. Inside, it buzzed with elegance, strings of instrumental music, champagne flutes sparkling in the hands of donors, gallery walls bathed in warm tones, each piece of art carefully lit like sacred relics. Nora entered alone, unnoticed by most, and let herself drift through the crowd with practiced grace. She spotted Adam near the central exhibit, tall and smiling in his tailored blazer, a glass of wine in hand. He was mid-conversation, relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in months. Standing beside him was Vivian Kane, sharp, polished, confident. Nora didn't approach. Instead, she kept her distance, watching from the edges like one would study a painting. Their body language said everything. The lean-in laughs, the way Vivian's hand briefly brushed Adam's arm, the comfort of proximity between two people who no longer pretended to be just colleagues. Nora circled the room slowly, weaving through conversations, pausing near sculptures and installations, but always keeping Adam in sight. No one noticed her watchful gaze. The way her eyes narrowed with each shared glance between him and Vivian, it wasn't jealousy she felt, it was confirmation. Like seeing the final piece of a puzzle click into place. As she moved toward the back of the gallery, she caught a glimpse of Adam and Vivian quietly slipping out of the main hall, their departure casual but deliberate. Nora's breath caught for a moment, then she straightened her shoulders, set down her glass, and followed. Each step quiet, steady, and filled with resolve. She was no longer there to guess, she was there to witness. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with framed sketches and minimalist installations, each piece whispering of stories unspoken. Nora moved quietly, the muffled sound of the Gala fading behind her. Her heels barely tapped against the polished concrete floor as she turned a corner and stopped. There, through the half-open door of a side room, she saw them. Adam and Vivian, standing far too close in the soft glow of a suspended glass sculpture. Vivian was laughing softly, a wineglass in one hand, the other resting gently on Adam's chest. He didn't move away. He smiled. They leaned in as if pulled by an invisible thread, and then came the moment Nora had already prepared herself for but still wasn't ready to witness. The kiss. It was not hesitant, not cautious. It was full of familiarity, of practiced intimacy. It wasn't new. Vivian's hand cupped Adam's jaw with ease, and his arm settled around her waist like it had done so many times before. Nora stood frozen in the shadowed hallway, the chilled air clinging to her skin. Her heart didn't race. It settled into a strange stillness. Because this, finally, was the truth. No more guessing, no more gaslighting herself into thinking she was overreacting. She reached slowly into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and lifted it with steady hands. The screen glowed as she opened the camera, and she began to record. The lens captured everything, the closeness, the kiss, the way Adam looked at Vivian like Nora hadn't seen in years. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply pressed record and documented the betrayal that had already been living in the corners of their marriage for months. It wasn't just about catching them, it was about freeing herself. There would be no denials, no elaborate lies, just footage, just the moment they gave up pretending. After a few more seconds, she ended the recording and lowered her phone. She took one final look at them, wrapped in each other, utterly unaware, and then turned, her footsteps just as quiet as before. Nora didn't need to confront them. She already had everything she needed. The truth wasn't loud. It had lived quietly in the shadows until now, and now it lived in the frame. Nora stepped away from the doorway and back into the main hall, the sounds of clinking glasses and gentle laughter growing louder with each step, as if the world had kept turning while hers had quietly come undone. The gallery's beauty, once captivating, now felt artificial, like stage lighting over a hollow set. She walked past guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits, their conversations swirling around art and donations, oblivious to the quiet devastation passing through them. No one noticed her expressionless face or the tight way she held her phone in her hand. There were no tears, no trembling hands, just a quiet finality in her stride. She paused at a large installation near the exit, a twisted metal sculpture meant to represent renewal. It struck her as ironic. Renewal had already begun for her, but not in the way the artist had intended. Without a backward glance, she walked out into the cool desert night, leaving behind the glittering illusion, the polite smiles, and the echo of a kiss that didn't belong to her. Outside, the air felt lighter, more honest. She didn't need to say a word to Adam. Not now, not ever. The truth had already spoken, and it was louder than anything she could have shouted. In that moment, as the gallery doors closed behind her, Nora realized there were no words left between them. Just a silence that said everything. The house was silent when Nora returned, its familiar walls bathed in soft lamplight, unchanged on the surface, but hollow in a way that was now unmistakable. She didn't bother turning on music or setting down her purse in its usual spot. Instead, she walked directly to the small drawer in the office, the one neither of them had opened in months. Inside was a manila folder, slightly worn at the corners, its contents long forgotten during one of their past attempts at working things out. It held the early draft of their divorce papers, paperwork left unsigned when they had convinced themselves the distance was temporary. Nora laid it on the kitchen counter and opened it. She reached for the printer, pulled out the freshly printed still image from the video, a freeze frame of Adam and Vivian, lips barely apart, their hands too comfortable on each other. She clipped it to the front of the folder, then she removed her wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had once symbolized a partnership full of hope, and placed it beside the papers. As a final gesture, she wrote a single note on a yellow sticky pad. "All that's left is your signature." She left it atop the folder like the last piece of an exhibit. Neat, quiet, impossible to misinterpret. She didn't wait for Adam to come home. She didn't want to hear explanations, apologies, or rehearsed regret. The final installation of their shared life was complete, and Nora was ready to step away from it for good. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of Nora's new temporary rental, an airy adobe studio nestled quietly near Canyon Road. With a cup of black coffee in hand and resolve steadier than ever, she sat at the small kitchen table and opened her laptop. She found the video file again, clear, unshakable proof of the betrayal, and attached it to a composed email addressed to the Board of Trustees and key donors of the foundation, where Adam and Vivian worked. The subject line read simply, "A necessary clarification." In a calm, direct message, she explained that as the spouse of a senior employee, she believed they deserved to know how company leadership conducted themselves, specifically at a donor-sponsor event, on company time, with company resources. She didn't rant, didn't accuse. She presented facts. The response came swiftly. Within 24 hours, Adam was placed on leave. By the end of the week, he had quietly resigned. Vivian's dismissal took longer, handled with careful PR spins and internal reshuffling, but the whispers in the art and nonprofit community spread fast. A woman once respected for her leadership and poise now walked the gallery halls with averted eyes and empty smiles. The scandal followed them like a shadow, subtle yet ever-present. And through it all, Nora said nothing more. Her silence echoed louder than outrage ever could. Reputations had been curated carefully, but, like any poorly mounted piece, they shattered the moment the truth was properly displayed. In the weeks that followed, Nora found herself breathing easier in the quiet sanctuary of her temporary adobe rental. The space was modest, but bathed in warm, natural light, its whitewashed walls and hand-thrown pottery reminding her that beauty didn't need to be loud to be powerful. She spent her mornings sketching exhibit ideas again, not for deadlines or board meetings, but for herself. Concepts flowed freely, her mind no longer weighed down by uncertainty or pretense. The children visited often, their loyalty unspoken but deeply felt. They had seen more than they let on, and when the truth surfaced, their support was instant and unwavering. Adam reached out, calls, messages, even a letter, but Nora didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. She had heard all she needed in the silence between his words, long before the affair had ever been exposed. Some friends asked if it had all been too final, too cold. Nora would simply smile and say, "You don't restore a cracked sculpture by pretending it isn't broken." And in that quiet, honest space, she began again. She walked the art district alone on weekends, rediscovering galleries she once loved. She no longer looked over her shoulder. She no longer needed closure. Her revenge hadn't come from anger, it came from freedom. In the quiet that followed, Nora wasn't just rebuilding. She was curating a new life, one filled not with betrayal and shadows, but with light, intention, and the kind of peace that no one could take from her again. The story of Nora Ellison teaches us that strength doesn't always come in the form of confrontation. Sometimes it's found in stillness, clarity, and the quiet courage to walk away. Nora's journey from silent suspicion to undeniable truth is a reminder that we should never ignore the quiet erosion of our happiness or the subtle signs of betrayal. Rather than reacting with fury, she chose dignity, using truth as her guide and self-respect as her compass. In a world that often glorifies dramatic revenge, Nora shows that the most powerful response is to protect your peace and move forward without looking back. She didn't just end a marriage, she reclaimed her narrative. She turned pain into purpose, silence into strength, and solitude into restoration. The lesson here is timeless. When trust is broken and love becomes one-sided, you don't have to stay and suffer. You have the right to choose yourself, to set boundaries, and to begin again. Healing doesn't require noise. Sometimes it just takes one decisive moment of truth, followed by the bravery to start a new chapter. Nora's story is a tribute to quiet resilience and the freedom that comes when you finally let go.